The courtroom was already tense before the cameras even finished settling into place. People seated in the gallery leaned forward slightly, sensing that something unusual was about to happen. The air carried that familiar mix of impatience and anticipation that always seemed to surround this room. Judge Judy sat at the bench, posture straight, eyes sharp, scanning the paperwork in front of her with the practiced speed of someone who had seen every excuse imaginable. She did not look impressed. Standing at one side of the courtroom was a young woman in an expensive blazer, her posture stiff with entitlement rather than nerves. Her hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, and yet her eyes kept darting around the room as if she were expecting someone to rush in and rescue her at any moment. This was not fear. It was disbelief. Disbelief that she was standing here at all. Across from her stood the plaintiff, an older woman with tired eyes and hands that trembled slightly as she clutched her documents. Her clothes were modest, worn but clean, and her expression carried the quiet exhaustion of someone who had been wronged and had waited a long time to be heard. She avoided looking directly at the young woman, as if doing so would reopen a wound she was struggling to keep closed. Judge Judy finally looked up. Her gaze landed first on the defendant, lingering just long enough to make the young woman shift her weight uncomfortably. "All right," Judge Judy said, her voice calm but edged with authority. "I've read the file. Now I want to hear it from you." The young woman sighed loudly, rolling her eyes just enough for the cameras to catch it. "This whole thing is ridiculous," she said. "I shouldn't even be here." "My father," Judge Judy raised a hand. "I didn't ask about your father. I asked about the case." There was a brief pause, the kind that feels longer than it really is. The young woman's lips pressed into a thin line. She was clearly not used to being interrupted, especially not by someone who refused to be impressed by her last name. "Well," she continued, her tone sharp, "this woman is exaggerating. I didn't damage anything. And even if something happened, it wasn't my fault." Judge Judy turned to the plaintiff. "You'll get your turn. Let her finish." The defendant straightened, clearly taking that as encouragement. "She's just trying to get money. People do that. They see an opportunity, and suddenly everything is a tragedy." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The plaintiff's hands tightened around her papers. Judge Judy's eyes narrowed slightly. "You're accusing her of lying?" "I'm saying she's mistaken," the young woman replied quickly. "Or confused. Or maybe she just wants attention." Judge Judy leaned back in her chair, studying her. "Interesting choice of words." The defendant shrugged. "I mean, look at her. She's emotional." That was when Judge Judy's expression changed. It wasn't anger yet, but it was no longer neutral. "Do not insult people in my courtroom," she said firmly. "Emotions don't invalidate facts." The young woman scoffed. "Whatever. This is all being blown out of proportion." Judge Judy turned to the plaintiff. "All right. Your turn. Tell me what happened." The older woman took a deep breath. Her voice was soft at first, but steady. She explained how the defendant had backed into her car in a parking lot, how she had waited patiently, how the young woman had stepped out, glanced at the damage, and dismissed it as nothing. She described asking for insurance information and being laughed at in response. She described days of unanswered calls and messages, and finally, the shock of being told there would be no compensation at all. As she spoke, the courtroom grew quiet. Even the defendant seemed momentarily bored rather than irritated, tapping her fingernail against the table. Judge Judy listened without interruption. When the plaintiff finished, Judge Judy nodded slowly. "Do you have photos?" "Yes, Your Honor." The plaintiff handed them over. Judge Judy examined the pictures carefully. "This isn't nothing," she said. "This is significant damage." The defendant rolled her eyes again. "Cars get scratched. It happens." Judge Judy looked up sharply. "You don't get to decide that after causing it." The young woman's face flushed. "I didn't cause it. There's no proof it was me." Judge Judy lifted one of the photos. "These were taken immediately after the incident. And you admitted you were there." I admitted I was in the parking lot, the defendant snapped. Not that I hit her car. Judge Judy sighed. You're splitting hairs. The defendant crossed her arms. This whole thing is unfair. Judge Judy raised an eyebrow. Unfair is damaging someone's property and refusing to take responsibility. That was when the young woman's frustration finally boiled over. She leaned forward, voice rising. You're being biased. You always side with people like her. The courtroom gasped. Judge Judy did not raise her voice. She did not need to. People like her, she repeated. The young woman hesitated, realizing too late that she had gone too far. I didn't mean, yes, you did, Judge Judy said. And you're not helping your case. The defendant's jaw clenched. She reached into her bag abruptly, pulling out her phone. You know what? This is ridiculous. I'm not going to sit here and be disrespected. Judge Judy's eyes locked onto the phone. Put that away. Instead, the young woman unlocked the screen, her fingers moving quickly. I'm calling someone who actually has authority. Judge Judy leaned forward. If you're calling your father, I don't care. I'm calling the police, the defendant snapped. A stunned silence filled the room. Judge Judy blinked once. Excuse me? You heard me, the young woman said loudly, holding the phone up as if it were a shield. You're harassing me. This is abuse of power. Judge Judy's expression hardened. This is a courtroom. You are here voluntarily. No one is harassing you. The young woman turned away slightly, already dialing. I don't have to listen to this. Judge Judy stood up slightly from her chair. Sit down and hang up that phone. But the young woman had already pressed the call button. She put the phone to her ear, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and confidence. Yes, hello? I need officers sent immediately. I'm in court, and the judge is targeting me unfairly. The plaintiff stared in disbelief. The gallery erupted into whispers. Judge Judy remained silent, watching. The young woman continued, her voice rising for effect. Yes, Judge Judy's courtroom. She's abusing her authority, and I feel threatened. Judge Judy's lips pressed together. 30 seconds passed. The defendant kept talking, exaggerating, gesturing wildly with her free hand, and then, slowly, reality began to settle in. Judge Judy leaned back, folded her arms, and waited. The young woman finished her call and lowered the phone with a smug expression, as if she had just delivered the final blow. They're on their way, she said. Let's see how this ends. Judge Judy met her gaze, calm and unshaken. Oh, it will end, she said quietly. Just not the way you think. The confidence on the young woman's face wavered for the first time, and in that moment, she had no idea that the call she had just made was about to turn this courtroom, and her own life, completely upside down. The courtroom remained frozen in a strange, uneasy silence after the young woman ended the call. Her phone stayed clenched in her hand, knuckles white, as if it were the last piece of control she had left. She leaned back in her chair, chin lifted in defiance, eyes daring anyone to challenge her. To her, this was no longer about a scratched car or a civil dispute. It had become a personal battle, one she was certain she could not lose. Judge Judy did not speak right away. She did not need to. Her stillness carried more weight than shouting ever could. She simply looked at the defendant, then briefly at the bailiff, then back again, her expression unreadable. You done? Judge Judy finally asked. The young woman smirked. For now. The police will handle it. Judge Judy nodded slowly. Good. We'll wait. That response caught the defendant off guard. She had expected outrage, maybe fear, or at least some hesitation. Instead, she was met with patience. That patience unsettled her. The plaintiff sat rigid in her chair, hands folded tightly in her lap. Her eyes flicked between the judge and the defendant, uncertainty written all over her face. She had come here hoping for justice, not a spectacle. The idea that someone could call the police on a judge in her own courtroom seemed unreal. The minutes dragged on. The defendant shifted in her seat, glancing at the door every few seconds. Each time it remained closed, her confidence thinned just a little. Judge Judy broke the silence. You said you felt threatened. Can you explain how? The young woman scoffed. You've been attacking me since I walked in here. You keep interrupting me, taking her side. That's intimidation. Judge Judy raised an eyebrow. Interrupting is intimidation now? You know exactly what you're doing, the defendant snapped. You're trying to embarrass me. Judge Judy tilted her head slightly. You don't need my help with that. A ripple of quiet laughter passed through the gallery. The defendant shot a furious look over her shoulder. I demand respect, she said sharply. Do you know who my father is? Judge Judy's gaze hardened. I don't care. The young woman leaned forward. He's a congressman. And when he hears about this, Judge Judy held up a hand. Stop. Right there. The defendant froze mid-sentence. This courtroom does not operate on threats, names, or connections, Judge Judy said evenly. It operates on facts. And facts don't care who your father is. The defendant's face reddened. You can't talk to me like that. I absolutely can, Judge Judy replied. And I will. Another glance toward the door. Still nothing. The defendant's voice wavered slightly. The officers will put a stop to this. Judge Judy nodded. I'm sure they'll be very interested in why they were called. The bailiff stood quietly at the side, arms crossed, alert but calm. He had seen many outbursts, but this one was different. This wasn't panic. It was arrogance unraveling. The plaintiff finally spoke, her voice trembling. Your Honor, I don't want any trouble. I just want what's fair. Judge Judy turned to her gently. I understand. The defendant rolled her eyes again. Here we go. Playing the victim. Judge Judy snapped her gaze back. Enough. The word cut through the room like a blade. You've talked over everyone, Judge Judy continued. You've shown disrespect to this court, to the plaintiff, and to common sense. And now you've escalated things by making a false emergency call. I didn't make a false call, the defendant argued. I felt threatened. Judge Judy leaned forward. Being told you're wrong is not a threat. The defendant opened her mouth to respond, but the sound of footsteps echoed faintly from outside the courtroom. Heads turned. The defendant's posture straightened instantly, relief flashing across her face. They're here, she whispered, almost smiling. The doors opened, and two uniformed officers stepped inside. The murmurs grew louder, then died down as the officers scanned the room. Judge Judy stood. Officers. The defendant shot to her feet. Thank God. She's been harassing me. I told you she was abusing her authority. One of the officers raised a hand. Ma'am, please sit down. The defendant hesitated. But, sit down, the officer repeated. Her smile vanished. She sat slowly, confusion flickering across her face. Judge Judy addressed the officers calmly. This young woman called 911 from my courtroom, claiming she was being threatened. The defendant interrupted, because I was. Judge Judy ignored her. She is a defendant in a civil case. She became upset when questioned and decided to escalate. The officers exchanged a glance. One of them turned to the defendant. Ma'am, why did you call emergency services? The young woman lifted her chin. Because the judge was targeting me. She was yelling, insulting me, and refusing to listen. The officer looked around the courtroom. Did you feel physically threatened? Well, no, she admitted. But emotionally, the officer nodded slowly. You understand 911 is for emergencies. Judge Judy folded her arms. Exactly. The defendant's voice rose. So now you're all against me? No, the officer said firmly. We're here to understand why an emergency line was used. The defendant swallowed. I told you, I felt attacked. Judge Judy spoke again. Being held accountable is not an attack. The officers asked a few more questions, their tone professional but increasingly serious. The defendant's answers grew shorter, less confident. Her earlier certainty dissolved as she realized this was not going according to plan. One officer stepped aside and spoke quietly into his radio. The defendant watched him, eyes wide. "What are you doing?" she demanded. "Checking the call," he replied. The color drained from her face. Judge Judy remained silent, letting the moment stretch. The plaintiff sat motionless, hardly daring to breathe. When the officer returned, his expression had changed. "Ma'am," he said to the defendant, "the recording shows no threat. This was a misuse of emergency services." "That's not fair," the defendant whispered. The officer's voice hardened slightly. "It's the law." The defendant looked at Judge Judy, panic now fully visible. "You did this on purpose." Judge Judy met her gaze. "You did this to yourself." The room was silent as the weight of that statement settled in. The young woman's phone slipped from her hand onto the table with a soft thud, and in that moment, she finally understood that calling 911 had not given her power, IT had taken it away. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted in a way that was impossible to ignore. The confident energy the young woman had walked in with was gone, replaced by a tight, brittle stillness. She sat frozen, shoulders tense, eyes darting between the officers, Judge Judy, and the people in the gallery who were now watching her with open curiosity instead of fear or admiration. The illusion she had built around herself was cracking. Piece by piece. One of the officers cleared his throat. "Ma'am, misuse of emergency services is a serious matter. We're not arresting you today, but this will be documented." The defendant's voice came out barely above a whisper. "Documented?" "Yes," the officer replied. "And depending on local laws, there may be consequences." She shook her head slowly, disbelief flooding her face. "You can't be serious." "I was just protecting myself." Judge Judy leaned forward. "You were trying to control the situation." The young woman snapped her gaze back to the bench. "You don't know me." Judge Judy didn't flinch. "I know enough." The officers stepped slightly to the side, making it clear they were finished intervening unless things escalated again. The courtroom exhaled collectively, though the tension remained thick. Judge Judy sat back down. "We are not done here." The defendant swallowed hard. "You chose to interrupt a legal proceeding," Judge Judy continued. "You chose to disrespect this court. And you chose to make a call that wasted public resources. None of that helps your case." The young woman tried to speak, but her words tangled together. I didn't think." "No," Judge Judy cut in. "You didn't." A hush fell over the room. Judge Judy turned to the plaintiff. "Thank you for your patience." The older woman nodded, eyes glistening. She looked exhausted, but there was a quiet relief in her expression now. For the first time since walking into the courtroom, she felt seen. Judge Judy returned her attention to the defendant. "Let's get back to the actual dispute. You damaged her vehicle. The evidence supports that." "I already said I didn't mean to," the defendant muttered. "Intent is irrelevant," Judge Judy replied. "Responsibility is not." The defendant shook her head. "This is unbelievable. My father is going to hear about this." Judge Judy sighed. "Good." The word landed harder than any lecture. "You might learn something," Judge Judy added. The defendant's eyes widened. "Are you threatening me?" "No," Judge Judy said calmly. "I'm educating you." She picked up the photographs again. "This damage required repair. The estimate is reasonable. You ignored her attempts to resolve this privately." The defendant's voice cracked. "I was busy." "Everyone is busy," Judge Judy said. "That doesn't excuse bad behavior." The gallery was silent now, fully absorbed. Judge Judy leaned forward slightly. "You've spent this entire case trying to avoid accountability. You tried to dismiss her. You tried to intimidate this court. And when that didn't work, you tried to bring in law enforcement as a weapon." The defendant clenched her fists. "I didn't know that's what it would turn into." "That's the problem," Judge Judy replied. You didn't think about consequences. The officers exchanged another glance, clearly in agreement. Judge Judy turned back to the plaintiff. Your claim is for the cost of repairs and court fees, correct? Yes, Your Honor. Judge Judy nodded. The evidence supports your claim. The defendant sat back, her face pale. Wait. You can't just, I can, Judge Judy said. And I am. The words were firm, final, but before delivering the judgment, Judge Judy paused. She looked directly at the defendant, her expression no longer sharp, but serious in a deeper way. Let me tell you something, she said. Power doesn't come from who your parents are. It comes from how you treat people when you think no one can make you answer for it. The defendant's eyes flickered downward. You walked in here thinking the rules didn't apply to you, Judge Judy continued. You were wrong. The silence felt heavy, almost suffocating. The defendant whispered, This is humiliating. Judge Judy nodded. It should be. A sharp intake of breath rippled through the room. Judge Judy straightened. Humiliation is often the first step toward humility. The defendant said nothing. Judge Judy glanced briefly at the officers. Thank you for responding. They nodded and moved toward the exit. As the doors closed behind them, the finality of the moment sank in. There would be no rescue. No phone call to fix this. No powerful name to undo what had already happened. The defendant's shoulders slumped. Judge Judy returned her attention to the case file. I am ruling in favor of the plaintiff. The defendant's head snapped up. How much? Judge Judy named the amount. It wasn't devastating, but it was significant enough to sting. That's ridiculous, the defendant muttered. Judge Judy looked at her one last time. So was your behavior. The plaintiff closed her eyes briefly, relief washing over her. The defendant stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, as the weight of consequences finally settled on her. She had come into the courtroom believing she was untouchable. Now, she was learning just how wrong she had been. The tension did not vanish when the ruling was announced. If anything, it changed shape, settling heavily around the young woman like a weight she could no longer shrug off. She sat there, motionless, staring at the bench as if she expected the words to reverse themselves if she looked hard enough. The amount Judge Judy had ordered her to pay echoed in her mind, but it wasn't the money that hurt the most. It was the loss of control. This is unbelievable, she said quietly, though there was no real fight left in her voice. Judge Judy gathered the papers in front of her. What's unbelievable is how hard you worked to make a simple situation worse. The defendant laughed once, bitter and hollow. You've ruined my reputation. Judge Judy looked at her steadily. Your actions did that. The plaintiff sat very still, hands folded, breathing slowly as if she were afraid that even a small movement might break the moment. After weeks of frustration, sleepless nights, and being dismissed as insignificant, she finally felt something close to peace. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She simply looked relieved. The young woman stood abruptly, chair scraping against the floor. So that's it? I just pay and leave? Judge Judy met her gaze. That's how accountability works. The defendant hesitated, then glanced toward the door, as if expecting someone to step in at the last second. No one did. You don't understand what you've done, she said. My father, Judge Judy cut her off immediately. Your father is not on trial. You are. The words landed like a final gavel strike. The defendant's shoulders slumped. He's going to be furious. Judge Judy's expression softened just slightly, not with sympathy, but with clarity. Then maybe this is a conversation you should have had a long time ago. The young woman opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. For once, there was nothing she could say. Judge Judy turned to the plaintiff. You will receive payment as ordered. If there are any issues, you know how to proceed. Thank you, Your Honor, the older woman said quietly. Her voice trembled, but her eyes were steady. Judge Judy nodded. Case closed. The bailiff called out the conclusion, and the sound seemed to snap the courtroom back into motion. People shifted, whispered, stood. The defendant remained frozen for a moment longer, as if she needed time to process that it was truly over. When she finally moved, her steps were slower than before. The confident stride she had arrived with was gone, replaced by something cautious and uncertain. As she passed the plaintiff, she stopped. "I didn't think it was a big deal," she muttered, not quite an apology, but not nothing either. The plaintiff looked up at her. "It was to me." The defendant nodded once, then turned away. Outside the courtroom, the noise of the hallway rushed in, loud and indifferent. Life moved on. Cases continued. But for the young woman, something had shifted. She pulled out her phone again, staring at the screen. No calls. No messages. No instant rescue. For the first time, she realized that her name, her connections, her confidence, none of it had mattered in that room. Only her choices had. Inside the courtroom, Judge Judy was already reviewing the next file, her expression unchanged, focused, ready. To her, this was another case resolved, another lesson delivered. But for the defendant, it would be remembered far longer, because in just a few minutes, she had learned something she had avoided her entire life. That authority does not come from power, it comes from responsibility. The hallway outside the courtroom felt colder than it had moments earlier. The young woman paused just beyond the doors, standing still as people brushed past her, their conversations blending into a dull, meaningless hum. No one paid her any special attention now. No whispers of importance. No looks of deference. She was just another person leaving a courtroom, carrying a result she hadn't wanted and consequences she hadn't planned for. She finally took a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her phone felt heavier in her hand than it ever had before. For years, it had been a tool of instant solutions, one call, one name, one reminder of who her father was, and problems seemed to disappear. Now it was silent, unhelpful, almost mocking. She replayed the moment she had dialed 911 in her mind. At the time, it had felt powerful. Bold. A way to flip the situation back in her favor. She had truly believed that the system would bend the moment she challenged it. Instead, it had stood firm, unmoved, and forced her to face herself in front of strangers. Down the hall, the plaintiff emerged more slowly, clutching her folder to her chest. She walked with the careful steps of someone who had spent a long time bracing for disappointment. When she noticed the young woman standing there, she hesitated. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The young woman looked away first. "I didn't think it would go that far," she said quietly. The older woman studied her face, seeing not arrogance now, but confusion and embarrassment. "It always does," she replied softly. "When people refuse to listen." The words lingered between them. The young woman nodded once, stiffly. "I guess. I didn't listen." The plaintiff didn't argue. She simply adjusted her grip on the folder. "I hope you don't do this to someone else." Then she walked away, disappearing into the flow of people. The young woman stood there for several seconds after that, feeling a strange tightness in her chest. It wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It was something unfamiliar and uncomfortable, self-awareness. Later that evening, she sat alone in her apartment, the quiet pressing in around her. The polished space, filled with expensive furniture and carefully chosen decor, felt hollow. She dropped her keys onto the counter and sank into a chair, staring at nothing. Her phone buzzed. Her father's name lit up the screen. She hesitated before answering. "What happened?" His voice demanded the moment she picked up. She opened her mouth, ready to defend herself out of habit, but the words didn't come. The familiar excuses felt thin now, almost childish. "I messed up," she said finally. There was a long pause on the other end. "You called the police on a judge?" he asked slowly. "Yes." Another pause. This one heavier. "That's not how power works," he said at last, his voice lower, quieter than she had ever heard it. "That's not how anything works." She swallowed hard. "I thought it would protect me." "It embarrassed you," he replied. "And it should." She flinched, but she didn't argue. "For once," he continued, "you were treated like everyone else." The line went dead. She set the phone down gently, her hands trembling. There was no anger left in her, only the dull ache of realization. The courtroom, Judge Judy's voice, the officer's calm expressions, the plaintiff's quiet dignity, it all replayed in her mind like a lesson she couldn't skip. Back in the courtroom, Judge Judy finished her day as she always did. Case after case, story after story. People came in defensive, angry, scared, entitled, desperate. Some left satisfied. Some didn't. But the law remained the same for all of them. As she stood to leave, she paused briefly, reflecting not on the drama, but on the principle behind it. Accountability wasn't punishment. It was correction. And sometimes, the loudest lessons were learned in silence afterwards. Days passed, the young woman paid the judgment. She didn't fight it. She didn't complain. Each step of the process reminded her of the moment she had lost control by trying too hard to keep it. She stopped mentioning her father's name as often. She caught herself listening more, interrupting less. The change wasn't dramatic, and it wasn't instant, but it was real, and somewhere in the back of her mind, Judge Judy's words remained, steady and unyielding. Power doesn't come from who you know, it comes from what you do when you're held responsible. That lesson stayed with her long after the cameras stopped rolling, long after the courtroom emptied, long after the regret faded into something quieter and more useful. Understanding.